Bane Occultist is the build that I progressed the furthest, the easiest, and the fastest with this league. It wasn't my first character, but most of the stuff this is using was acquired with this character during the just about 10 days of total playtime clock. Despite comparably low damage, it's great for farming thanks to chaos explosions and plenty survivable with defensive aura setup for a lot of evasion and enough armor to enable Molten Shell with a big hit point pool, spell suppression, cap chaos resistance, and stun immunity. The character is level 97 with complete Atlas and maxed out Heist, and all this in hardcore and solo cell phone. So if you plan to play without these restrictions, your results will without doubt be better than mine. But before we go over the character, I'm very happy to share with you some details about the sponsor of this video. Opera GX is the browser for your gaming needs. When I was first approached to do a segment for Opera GX, I had been using the browser already a number of weeks. The reasons are simple, but there are many, too many to mention them all. In short, I would say that this browser is the perfect all-round application to run on your second screen during gaming. It offers all the important features like social media integration and music player integration, effectively eliminating the need to run most other applications, and at the same time it's incredibly lightweight and can be further optimized for performance. With GX profiles, you can easily customize and manage different browsing experiences for different needs. Just click the gear symbol to go to options and click manage GX profiles and then create profile. For example, if you want to do a live stream, you can use the streaming preset configuration to prevent yourself from doxing yourself and showing any private information on screen. If your computer isn't running smoothly or you just need as much computing power as possible for gaming, you can use the potato preset, which deactivates most features beyond basic browsing. The moment you click Add New Profile, a new shortcut appears on your desktop and your taskbar, which you can then click to open a new browser window using that particular preset. Whenever you feel you want to free up more resources but don't want to close the browser, you can open GX Control and use the Hot Tabs killer to identify the most resource-draining tabs and close them directly there. By the way, GX Control also lets you put a cap on how much bandwidth and CPU and RAM you want your browser to use. By clicking the controller symbol, you can get into the GX Corner, which is a super cool gaming news center where you can stay up to date with free games and new releases, the best deals for games on sale, and breaking gaming news all in one easily accessible place. Whenever you want to make your switch, there's an import tool that allows you to easily import all your settings from your previous browser to GX to make your transition as smooth as possible. There's also a mobile version of Opera GX called GX Mobile, and both desktop and mobile versions of Opera GX are completely free. Use the link below or scan the QR code on screen to download this literal game changer of a browser. Hi and welcome to another Capmaster video. This time I'm showcasing my best build in Lake of Kalandra League so far. A chaos damage over time build on the Witch's Occultist Ascendancy. I'm very happy with this build. I'm looking forward to pushing it to 100 and or doing some min-maxing and then some bosses on this build. This character uses Bane as its main skill and Blight as well as Essence Drain to deal with enemies that survive longer than a single application of Bane. On top of that, the setup utilizes a handful of other skills as usual to grant mobility and ensure survivability as needed in hardcore. This is pretty powerful overall, but we're looking at an active playstyle. If you're not a friend of that, this build might not be for you. I am going to elaborate on all the features in the following sections of the video, but before that I want to give you the most notable downsides of this setup, just so we get this out of the way. I still think this is an awesome build, but there are many things you want to have in Path of Exile. Most builds can't have them all, and come with a number of downsides or compromises. So as we established, this is a rather active playstyle, not only during bossing. The next downside I feel is the low damage and dependence on explosions. It generally is great all around for farming and clearing stuff very fast, but once you find yourself in a true single target situation and or without enemies that leave destroyable corpses, tanky enemies are going to stand out massively. Now, it's still a damage over time build, so you have great damage uptime while rotating through your skills, and ample time to reposition, all while keeping up your maximum damage. But your maximum damage is just not very high overall, and it will take a long time to kill things. It's just not a fast bossing build in its current state. I might be able to give up some of the defenses in favor of some big damage scaling and get some upgrades, but I doubt that I will get it beyond, say, a million of Cirrus DPS without seriously compromising the defensive situation. It's also worth mentioning that as an Occultist, this build is pretty slow. You just don't have access to a lot of movement speed on the tree here. We made the best of the situation, but I don't have Tailwind boots and rely on the Onslaught/movement speed hybrid craft from the bench, so overall, while it's a great all-round farmer, it's far from the fastest build around. Last but not least, this character is very dependent on flask uptime, both for elemental ailments and for the armor to scale Molten Shell. While I managed to get the stun avoidance to 100%, it is only able to deal with shock and freeze or chill through the suffixes on the utility flasks, and it removes ignites only with one of the 2 life flasks that I'm running. Ignites are usually not a problem because Soul of Aberrath cuts down their duration by 60%. The build doesn't struggle with poisons thanks to capped chaos resistance, therefore I'm running this ignite remove suffix instead of a poison remove suffix I'd usually want. The other elemental ailments, Brittle, Scorch and Sap, we have no way of dealing with. That's fine because these are mostly found in Delirium content like the Simulacrum, which I'm not running at the moment. Without flasks or other buffs up, the build also only has about 8000 armor, which makes the Molten Shell buff value a bit smaller than the value of a high-level sealskin. But with the Granite Flask with increased armor suffix, we do reach 15,000 armor rating, so the Molten Shell buff is well worth it. Because the build clears well, this is usually not a problem, and you generate enough flask charges to keep those buffs up, but in single target situations, you may notice the low armor during flask downtime. There are other sources of physical damage mitigation in the build that I will mention later. That all said, I still think it's an amazing character. These downsides are things that I can live with. I knew beforehand what kind of character this was going to be, and it's all made up for by the fact that it's really good at what it does. It's easy to put together, fun to play, and feels powerful at pretty much all stages of the game except for the very highest endgame bosses. I don't think that this would be hard at all to copy in a trade league, and you'd likely be able to make a whole lot of improvements, especially in softcore, where dying is not an issue. All content should be possible on this build with some modifications and more investment. Also, 2 quick disclaimers, especially because I expect a lot of new players to be watching this. I mentioned in the intro that I completed the Atlas and maxed out my heist within 10 days of playtime, but I want to make sure that it's clear none of the things I accomplished here are super impressive. I've been taking it really easy on playtime in this league and focused a lot on other things in my content creation projects in my real life. And on top of that, I'm not even such a great player. I may have had some decent runs in Hardcore Solo Self-Found and in the Gauntlet, but I make many mistakes, and knowing that, I often opt for the slow and safe route rather than actual top-end accomplishments. But my idea with this video is that if I, as a mediocre skill level player, can get this stuff done in like 200 hours of playtime with all the restrictions of Hardcore and Solo Self-Found, you can do it faster if you copy this build in a league without those restrictions. And just one more thing, this is not a full build guide. There are amazing build guides out there that go into in-depth explanations of the different ways to solve problems that a particular build poses, and well, this is just not that. I do aim to explain how the build works and how I put it together, but it's more of a build showcase, I would say. I'm just limited in Solo Self-Found to the things I have access to, so builds grow organically based on what the game hands me rather than following a carefully laid out, optimized plan of action. But that's not a bad thing. In general, I think whenever you play a specific build in Path of Exile, you should not blindly follow one build or guide, but rather look at a number of different builds for the same main skill and ascendancy and pay attention to what they have in common and where they differ. That way it is easier to understand what is mandatory and what is optional, and where you can adjust the build to your preference and your circumstances. Blindly following a popular, well-made build guide can be a foolproof approach, but there can be cheaper solutions if you're willing to look for alternative ways to solve problems, and engaging critically is a way better way to learn how the game works. With that out of the way, let's get into how the skills in this build work. Bane applies a debuff in an area which deals chaos damage over time. The base duration is 2 seconds. The special property of Bane is that you can not only link it with support gems, but you can also link Hex Curse active gems. The linked hexes are also applied to the enemies, and the debuff gets a more damage multiplier and increased duration based on the number of curses applied in this way. This makes for comfortable, automatic application of multiple curses with almost no trade-off and no specific itemization needed, which enables explosions from the Profane Bloom Ascendancy passive. We apply 3 hexes in total to maximize the amount of damage enemies take from our debuffs. Important to note, Bane does have the trigger tag, and just like with any other trigger gem, supported spells cannot be cast manually anymore. Also, similar to cast when damage taken support, a Bane gem can only trigger hexes from cursed skill gems with the same level requirement or a lower level requirement than itself. With Bane, most packs you just click once and they die to the debuff. Thanks to the Profane Bloom explosions, tanky blue monsters, rare monsters, and even the occasional unique monster die instantly if they're in the middle of a big pack of monsters that happens to explode. The Bane debuff lasts over 5 seconds, but does not stack with itself, so for everything that does not die instantly, we use Blight and Essence Drain as additional damaging skills. Blight is a channeling skill, which also applies a debuff to enemies in an area, which deals chaos damage over time. The base duration is 2.5 seconds. Unlike Bane though, Blight's debuff can stack up to 20 times. It locks you in place, but it deals really good damage, and it's your bread and butter for single target. It also applies a short hinder debuff that slows enemy movement speed to any enemy who isn't already affected by the Blight, so usually the first time you lay it on them. This can, however, also be used with a hit and run strategy in a single target fight, where you let the debuff fall off and then reapply it to benefit from the slow again. Blight is a channeling skill, and here's something really cool not everyone knows. Starting to channel counts as cast and interrupts Withering Step, but continuing to channel does not interrupt Withering Step. I'll talk about this more when I explain Withering Step. There's also a Val version of the Blight skill gem, which grants the Val version of the skill on top of the regular skill. The Val version applies 3 layers of a stronger version of the debuff that's powerful and lasts longer and always hinders enemies. It also makes hindered enemies take increased chaos damage from all sources, augmenting basically all your damage for a short duration. Like all Val skills, this requires Val souls for casting, which you can gain by killing monsters or damaging rare and unique enemies. On use, souls cannot be gained for a few seconds, the so-called soul gain prevention time. Essence Drain fires a projectile which, you guessed it, also applies a debuff to enemies in an area which deals chaos damage over time. Its base duration is 3.8 seconds. This you want to apply periodically to boost single target damage in single target situations that take more than just one Bane cast and some Blight channeling. It also grants regeneration based on the debuff damage, and the debuff can be spread. Both of these things, however, are negligible in our setup because we do not use it in clear, but just for bosses. Now, you may have noticed that all 3 of these skills share the line modifiers to spell damage apply to this skill's damage over time effect. This is stated here because naturally, damage modifiers for damage types such as attack, spell, area, projectile, etc. do not affect damage over time effects caused by skills of these types. They just affect the hit portion. Note that damage type scaling, like increased chaos damage, on the other hand, of course affects both hits and damage over time. Anyway, the line about the modifiers exists so that spell damage increases and more multipliers from support gems do scale the damage over time effects of these skills, so you actually have support gem options. It also makes it very easy to scale the damage early on in the game by just picking nodes with spell damage in the tree and using wands and other items with spell damage for your equipment. The 3 curses we apply with Bane are, in order of importance, Despair, because it's the biggest damage option. It lowers enemy chaos resist and increases damage taken from damage over time. Temporal Chains slows enemies and makes effects on them expire slower, such as your damaging debuffs or your other debuffs, and it also reduces enemy regeneration by slowing it down. Punishment makes enemies take largely increased damage when they are on low life being 50% life or less, and it adds a powerful 10% of overkill damage from killing hits against cursed enemies as reflect damage in a small area of effect around them. Your explosions are based on enemy life and therefore deal lots of damage, and 10% of overkill is not insignificant and helps out wherever explosions happen around enemies. Our aura setup is, in order of importance, Determination, which provides flat armor and a more multiplier to your armor rating. Grace, which provides flat evasion and a more multiplier to your evasion rating. We use a Val Grace skill gem here, so we can use the Val version of Grace, which gives us a temporary additional chance to evade and makes suppressed spell damage against you unlucky. Discipline grants energy for our hit point pool, thanks to Ghost Dance with around 26,000 evasion. Every time we get hit and lose a Ghost Shroud, we recover more than 750 energy shield from Ghost Dance. Without Discipline, the energy shield pool on this build is just too small to make good use of this strong recovery, which is why we run it. Malevolence scales our damage over time and globally increases skill effect duration of all skills. You need quite a bit of trickery to fit all 4 and still have enough mana for all your casts, as they have a combined base mana reservation of 185%. But I managed to do so without an Enlighten support gem or a Helmet Corrupt implicit, so there's probably some room for more. For our utility skills, we most importantly have Withering Step. Withering Step is a movement skill that grants a buff. It applies wither debuffs to enemies around you, which increase chaos damage taken, as long as you have that buff. The buff also grants both Elusive and Phasing. Elusive grants bonus movement speed and a chance to avoid damage from hits in a large amount when it's first applied, and then the effectiveness decays over time. Phasing allows the player to ignore unit collision, i.e. the ability to move through enemies. Using any skill ends Withering Step's effects and removes all buffs. Withering Step is instant itself. It has no cast time and therefore can be used during other skills, also during channeling Blight. Now, as I mentioned earlier, continuing to channel Blight does not end Withering Step's effects, so you can benefit from the defensive aspect, the avoid damage from hits chance, while standing still and channeling. In other builds, this skill is important for the Wither debuff, which increases chaos damage taken and can stack up to 15 times, but on this one it only kickstarts the Wither stacks. It is not so important because 15 seconds into boss fights, Withering Presence makes it so that everything that lives long enough in your range is fully withered permanently anyway. For mobility, we use Flame Dash, which is the best movement skill in the game and mandatory because it can teleport you over edges and beams in boss fights. You have to be mindful of your stacks in this build because Flame Dash and Withering Step both have the blink tag and therefore share a cooldown, which means whenever you use Withering Step, you lose 1 charge on your Flame Dash and the cooldown doesn't start to recover before the effect of Withering Step ends. This is a great reason to run Shield Charge because it does not have a cooldown and lets you get from pack to pack faster or even rush to the boss or the exit in heists. It allows you to have Flame Dash up for when you really need it. Enduring Cry generates endurance charges for additional physical mitigation and recovers a decent amount of life on use, so you can save flask uses when there is no way to regain flask charges. It also grants some extra physical mitigation during a short buff duration based on your endurance charges. Decoy Totem taunts enemies and tanks their damage. In Path of Exile, taunted enemies deal 10% less damage to everything that is not the source of the taunt, which means that even if enemies target this totem with their AoE skills and you get hit because you stand in the AoE, they still deal less damage to you because of this effect. The alternate quality gem Anomalous Decoy Totem regenerates absurd amounts of life with gem quality scaling. Now for links, we run our main skill in the body armor, which is our only 6 link. We link Bane to Despair, Temporal Chains and Punishment, and to the Controlled Destruction support gem, which grants a more damage multiplier without any downsides as damage over time cannot crit anyway, and Swift Affliction, which gives you a big more multiplier, which is a trade-off with duration, as it also is a less multiplier to duration. But our duration is still above 5 seconds with Bane, so it's not too bad because you generally don't want enemies to live that long anyway. Our 3 defensive aura gems are in a +2 area of effect gems helmet, because all auras do have the AoE tag and benefit from the additional levels, granting stronger effects. I also put my decoy totem in here because totem life scales off of the gem level, and the regeneration of the totem is based on its total life, making it more survivable and more capable of tanking enemy damage. In one of the 4 links, we run Molten Shell plus Enduring Cry, both linked to increased duration, from which both benefit. I also run Second Wind, which does not give Molten Shell anything because Molten Shell is instant, but it makes Enduring Cry able to store 2 uses, and because it has 20% quality, it comes with no downside at all. You want to care a little bit before, because without levels or quality, it has a malus and reduces the cooldown recovery of linked skills. In one of our 3 socket items, I run Shield Charge with faster attacks and Malevolence in the loose socket. Although it doesn't really matter whether it's linked or not, since faster attacks does not affect it. In my other 3 link, I have both Withering Step and Flame Dash linked to a low-level Arcane Surge support gem, so that every cast grants and refreshes the Arcane Surge buff, which grants a global more damage multiplier to spell damage, which affects all our damage over time effects as explained before. In a 4-link +1 area of effect gems pair of gloves, I run Val Blight and Essence Drain, both linked to efficacy rather than controlled destruction because it increases the duration, and Void Manipulation over Swift Affliction because Void Manipulation does not have a less duration multiplier. This, I feel, is a good middle ground between scaling the damage of these skills and them having a decent duration, so you don't need to reapply them all the time. Now for the gear, our 6-link body armor is Cherubim's Maleficence. This is a decent armor evasion chest on the Triumphant Lamella base, which has a big amount of armor and evasion defenses, and up to 80% increased chaos damage, which is really good. Increased damage multipliers do stack additively with each other, so the more you already have, the lower the relative gain they provide. But at this point in the build, it's still 18% more if I go from no chest piece to Cherubim's Maleficence. Sadly, this is not that easy to find anymore after unique changes. I only found 1 overall despite a lot of heisting, and I'd really like to double corrupt 1. But it's also not super mandatory for the build and can be pretty much replaced with any other 6-link if you please. For my wand, I got lucky and found a +1 to chaos spell skill gems, which raises the base damage of all my chaos skills, and damage over time multiplier wand, which had an open suffix slot for chaos damage over time multiplier. Damage over time multiplier is another multiplicative scaling layer separate from increases, and therefore it's a really good stat. However, if you can't get a good wand, spell damage also works, and you can also use the chaos damage increased craft if both multipliers are already on. +1 to all spell skill gems would also be great, as that scales all skills in this build, including the auras. On this slot, I don't expect an upgrade at all without investing heavily. This is already a great solo self-found wand. For my shield, I am using an evasion energy shield base in order to fuel ghost dance, with a good chunk of life, some suppression to get me to 100%, a little bit of block, and the armor during soul gain prevention craft, which I think is pretty underrated. This brings my total armor to well above 20,000 with all buffs up, which makes Molten Shell very worth it. Between my boots, helmet and gloves, I also aim for life and suppression as needed, because we have no suppression on our body armor, and the more suppression you get on gear, obviously the less you need on the tree. I made sure that all 3 boots, helmet and gloves have some evasion, so that the suppression mastery, which grants 12% chance to suppress spell damage if boots, helmet and gloves have evasion, is enabled. Although I am sure this also works with non-evasion bases as long as you craft a small amount of evasion onto them. On both helmet and gloves, you can get a hybrid mod for plus level of area of effect gems and increased area of effect from unveiling or crafting on your bench after having unveiled the mod. This is useful for our secondary damage setup and our aura gems as explained in the link setup section. Now this is also a great point to talk about Eldritch Implicits that we would want, since you can only get these on helmet, gloves, boots and body armor, and we use a unique body armor and therefore we don't have any on there. I currently have physical damage taken as fire, ether implicit on the helmet. This is also available as a cold, lightning or chaos version, which also would work fine as we're capped for chaos. But it's worth noting that cold damage can apply freeze or chill and lightning damage can apply shock, so fire is great because it's not very scary. For my Searing Exarch implicit, I would really like Despair Curse effect, but I have not hit it yet. On the gloves, I currently have Hinder and Intimidate, which are both not very useful. I would like Chaos damage over time multiplier from Searing Exarch and spell suppression from either if it helps me with gear upgrade or allows me to refund things in the tree. On boots, I currently have stun avoidance to cap stun avoidance and Warcry speed for faster enduring cry, but really I would want chance to avoid shock or freeze from Searing Exarch to stack to immunity, and if needed ailment avoidance from ether, or if not needed I could go for elusive effect or cooldown recovery for travel skills or enduring cry. Now for your amulet you usually want to go with your off stats, which would be strength and intelligence, but as I do have enough intelligence I went for a strength and dexterity base. Good stats like +1 gems and damage over time multiplier are available on amulets, however I hit triple tier 1 stats with life, evasion and cold resistance, and then just crafted lightning plus chaos because I needed the resists at the time and settled for it. Acrimony is a cheap damage over time anoint, which will be replaced later with prismatic skin or crystal skin if it allows me to achieve shock or freeze immunity. On my rings right now I have mostly resists and life. Importantly, I unveiled non-channeling skills have -10 to mana cost on one of my rings, which helps massively with being able to run all skills while reserving most mana. On my Amethyst ring, I got only tier 2 life, but I got lucky with tier 1 energy shield and tier 3 evasion. For the anoints, we get effect for empowering towers to buff other towers to scale them beyond upgrading them to tier 3 towers, and the Meteor Tower Burning Ground anoint for single target damage and strong synergy with the Despair Curse, which increases damage taken from damage over time effects. On my belt, I went for strength. I need a good chunk of strength somewhere because you need 155 strength for the level 20 strength gems we're using in this build. And careful, if you hit 21 by corrupting them, you actually need 159 strength total. Other than that, I got life, resistance, and an armor and evasion craft. It would be nice to have flask mods such as reduced charges used or increased duration of flask effects, and maybe we'll get that in a future upgrade. Now we'll quickly go over the tree and the ascendancies as well as the cluster jewels. This is the tree. I'm going to share a paste bin so you can import my build into Path of Building and look at it yourself, but I'll of course also talk about some priority choices here. The general idea is that we going from Witch start, mostly path into the shadow area of the tree, grabbing the reservation between Shadow and Ranger, and then dipping into some of the Ranger start area to pick up life and suppression mostly, alongside some movement speed. One of the key priorities is life, which is always a priority. A life-based Path of Exile endgame build should aim for 180% increased maximum life total at the very least, if possible 200% or more. This build has a total of 183% from the tree, 195% including my rare jewels. In order to maximize the final life value, we pick up both life masteries that are valuable, which are the +50 flat life and 10% increased life. The downside of reduced recovery rate does not apply to most of our recovery because it only applies to recovery over time and not to instant recovery, and this build has a lot of instant recovery on certain trigger conditions. The next priority would be reservation efficiency. Like I mentioned before, we do need a lot because we're running 3 50% base reservations and 1 35%. We take the entirety of the Influence cluster, the Charisma cluster, the Evasion Mastery for Grace Reservation Efficiency, and the Energy Shield Mastery for Discipline Reservation Efficiency. We also have 2 small cluster jewels with reservation efficiency rolled with notables specifically for Determination and Malevolence. You need at least 100% total reservation efficiency increase to get a 50% aura to a 25% reservation or below. Malevolence and Determination end up reserving just below 25%, and Grace slightly more with almost 28%. Discipline has a base reservation of only 35% and goes down to around 19%. We end up reserving all but 52 mana. Without the -10 cost ring, this would be very problematic and would require further investment in reservation efficiency or mana regeneration in order to not run out of mana while casting. The next thing we prioritize in the tree is Ghost Dance. This is a defensive powerhouse for builds that have both investment in evasion and investment into energy shield. With Ghost Dance, you cannot regain energy shield to above evasion, which is absolutely no problem because we have almost 26,000 evasion with Grace. Every 2 seconds, you gain a Ghost Shroud up to a maximum of 3. Whenever you get hit, you lose a Ghost Shroud, and whenever you lose a Ghost Shroud, you gain 3% of your evasion value as energy shield, which is well above 750 ES. This is great sustain and mitigation for hits. We also prioritize spell suppression. Between the 2 notables, Quickstep and Intuition in Ranger Start, and the 2 small nodes next to them, you get 24%. The notable Resourcefulness in the Shadow area grants 8%, the Instinct cluster grants 22%, and the Suppression Mastery, if Boots, Helmet and Gloves have evasion, grants another 12% chance. Adding these together, you already have a total of 66% from the tree, which means you only need 34% gear stats in total, which is super doable between Boots, Helmet, Gloves and Shield. In the worst case scenario, anointing Inveterate or Entrench on your amulet for another 12% is an option, although it should only be a temporary solution. Thanks to Instinct, we also recover 50 energy shield every time we suppress spell damage, which adds up quite a bit when getting hit by a lot of monsters. Spell suppression already cuts all spell hits in half, so a 600 damage spell hit becomes a 300 damage hit. Getting to recover 50 energy shield off of that hit negates another significant portion of it. There's also some investment into curses on the tree, as we do need Whispers of Doom for that additional curse. The default limit to the number of curses you can apply is 1, so you need 2 additional curses to be able to run all 3 of them. We get the blind from the mastery to be extra safe for mapping. Blinded monsters have less accuracy, making them even less likely to hit you with their attacks. For a chaos damage and damage over time investment, we pick the Atrophy cluster and the Mastery, which gives 1% chaos damage over time multiplier per 4% chaos resist. Since we're above 72%, that is 18% dot multi for just 1 point. I also use a large cluster jewel with Unholy Grace and Unwaveringly Evil, as well as increased effect of small nodes. Unspeakable Gifts or Wicked Pall would also be interesting as third notable, but only Wicked Pall would be possible instead of mana regeneration. Unwaveringly Evil and Increased Effect are both prefixes, just like Unspeakable Gifts, and jewels can only have 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes. It would require item level 75 as well, which this cluster jewel is not. I also invested into stun avoidance when my gear became good enough to be capped for chaos resistance without one with evil. I refunded out of it and couldn't get the Corrupted Blood Immunity Mastery there anymore, so I got Tolerance instead, which gives me 60% chance to avoid stuns for 3 points and allows me access to the Corrupted Blood Immunity gear instead. Stun immunity is great, especially with the Arch Nemesis mod that has double stun duration, which can be really annoying and potentially be lethal when you get stunned, and it prevents you from repositioning to a safe spot. Getting stun immunity also allows for getting a different major god power in the Pantheon. Prior to stun immunity, you should always run Soul of the Brine King to at least avoid getting chain stunned. Now for the Ascendancy choices, we first pick Void Beacon, which reduces chaos resistance and life regeneration on enemies. Next we prioritize Withering Presence, which gives you a lot of chaos resistance, which makes it really easy to cap your character's chaos resistance, a global More multiplier for chaos damage, and guaranteed Wither uptime in boss fights. On top of that, enemies deal less damage over time. In the Merciless Lab, just before you start power mapping, you should go for Profane Bloom. This allows you to apply curses to hexproof enemies, which counters the mod that counters you the most, and makes them die just as easy as everything else. It also grants an explosion chance on your cursed enemies, which really helps the clear, as you have probably seen in the footage. It's very satisfying and makes the build feel great, however, it's not really needed before maps, because monster density before maps is just not big enough to really benefit from it. Last but certainly not least, we pick Malediction, which gives us another +1 curse, and the Malediction debuff, which makes enemies deal less damage and take more damage. For the Pantheon God powers, as discussed, we use the Brine King until we get stun immunity, and then change to Solaris. Now, the God powers can be switched for free in town or in your hideout, and are designed to be super situational, and you should switch between the augmented Lunaris for farming and the augmented Solaris for bossing, and whatever small one fits the content, but I'm really dumb and lazy and always forget to switch them, so I opted to permanently run Solaris for damage reduction and no critical extra damage on consecutive crits, and reduced elemental damage taken if you have not been hit recently, which is great against elemental damage over time effects like Maven's Cold Degeneration Ground or Burning Ground, because these don't hit, and in general evasion builds don't get hit for a long time anyway, so this reduction is up often. For the minor god power, I use Soul of Aberrath because it makes you immune to the insane Burning Ground from Arch Nemesis and from Searing Exarch monsters, so the Burning Ground does nothing but buff your movement speed. The massive reduction to ignite duration also trivializes most ignites in the game. Now for numbers, I'm not a big numbers guy, but if you bring up this build in Path of Building, you can easily see that this build under perfect conditions deals well above 500,000 of Cirrus DPS. This is assuming that you have maximum Blight stacks up, at the same time as always keeping Essence Drain and Bane on your enemy, which is a little bit unrealistic, so let's assume it's just 500,000. But as soon as the enemy is at 50% or lower, the increased damage taken from punishment kicks in, bringing us to a total of 700,000 full damage over time DPS against Guardian and Pinnacle bosses. So the truth is somewhere in between, but definitely well above 500,000 of Cirrus DPS. This is not great, but granted you position correctly and survive for a long time, should be enough to get pretty much every boss down if you really want to. We also have a decent effective hit pool against all damage types, especially with buffs up, and even against tier 16 map monsters, we have on average 76% chance to evade. Now before we conclude the video, I quickly want to go over the upgrades that I feel are still easily possible. I already mentioned most of these during the video, but just to have it in one section, I'll go over them again quickly here. As we mentioned, there are the Eldritch Implicits, which would help me massively towards ailment immunity. If I get ailment immunity, this would take pressure off of the flask setup and I'd be able to get defensive benefits on the flask suffixes. I could craft a new pair of gloves with Essence of Delirium to grant 30% more damage over time to the socketed gems to help my single target damage. This can also be combined with the plus AoE gems Craft or Unveil, and could give a decent boost to the overall damage. My rings I could also change if I have overall better resists on gear, and here we could go for Iolite base rings with Essence of Envy or Essence of Delirium craft for increases to chaos damage or damage over time multiplier stats. On the amulet slot, we could get a +1 Chaos or a +1 all skill gems mod, and you can also roll damage over time multiplier. Also, as I mentioned, we could go for a more expensive anoint, like Crystal Skin or Prismatic Skin, to raise my maximum elemental resistances and possibly help with reaching elemental ailment avoidance. Now, that's about all I have for you today. Make sure, if you have any questions or suggestions how I could easily improve this build, to leave them in the comments down below. If you want to engage in a conversation, you can always join my Discord server, where not only I, but also a lot of other helpful people give build advice and answer questions. And of course, you can always come to my live streams on twitch.tv/catmasterop, which you should be following to be notified whenever I do go live. If you're generally interested in the Path of Exile community, I'd also like to recommend my podcast, Faded Connections, which I host together with Valor Mage, where we welcome a lot of interesting guests from the community. Our most recent episode with the boys from poewiki.net was a full blast, very informative, entertaining, and just all around cool listen, and I hope you give it a try. Thank you for watching for this long, and a special thanks to the people who keep renewing their Twitch subscriptions, as well as my patrons. Your names are now shown on the screen, and you will see me in the next video. Have a wonderful day.